Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening, and welcome to the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C.'s Foreign Policy Discussion, 20 Years Gone, the Rwandan Genocide and Echoes in International Intervention. I'm Heidi Shue, President of the World Affairs Council, Washington, and on behalf of the Board of Directors and members, I welcome you here tonight. 20 years ago today, on April 7, 1994, members of the Rwandan majority ethnic group, the Hutus, began a genocidal mass slaughter of their smaller ethnic minority Tutsi neighbors. It lasted 100 days and left approximately 800,000 dead. 20% of the nation perished, including 70% of the Tutsis living in Rwanda at that time. The killing served as both an impetus for the creation of the International Criminal Court, and its spillover set off violence in neighboring Democratic Republic of the Congo that continues to this day. Seemingly, against all odds, Rwanda itself has held together and has staged somewhat of a comeback as a nation, with today even considerable efforts being put into developing tourism as an industry and improving educational access. So on this day, when Rwanda marks the anniversary of this terrible self-inflicted wound, we are fortunate to bring together a group to help us look at how this unspeakable thing happened in the last decades of the 20th century, what lessons have been learned by Rwandans and by the world, and perhaps sketch out for us what we can expect in the coming years in the Central African region, not just in Rwanda, but in neighboring DRC and the broader area. David Bosco is an assistant professor of international politics in the School of International Service at American University. He previously worked as deputy director of the joint United Nations-NATO project focused on repatriating refugees and is the author of the book Five to Rule Them All on the UN Security Council. He is currently researching the International Criminal Court for an upcoming book. Allison Giffen is a senior associate and co-director of the Future of Peace Operations program and leads the Civilians in Conflict project at the Stimson Center. She has long worked on issues related to the prevention of violence against civilians and mass atrocities and served as project director of a study on ex-combatants in the Sierra Leone. She has also served in Sudan to organize, guide, and apply the global strategy of international NGOs in the obtaining of citizens' rights. Our moderator this evening is Mike Brand. He currently works at Safer World in its U.S. office. He has worked extensively on the issues of human rights, education, advocacy, and atrocity prevention. He is the author of the article Employing Prevention to Prevent Mass Atrocities. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our panel. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Heidi, and the World Affairs Council, and our panelists. I want to begin tonight's discussion with a brief background on the Rwandan genocide and the role of the international community. These background comments are not meant to be an exhaustive history of the genocide, but merely some snapshots of key events. 20 years ago, on April 6, 1994, began one of the worst atrocities the world has ever witnessed. With the downing of President Habyarimana's plane, it was as if a switch was flipped to start the genocide. Almost immediately, roadblocks were set up in the streets of Kigali. Death squads were made up of Rwandan armed force and the Interahamwe militias sought out Tutsis and Hutu moderates from predetermined lists and slaughtered them with extreme prejudice and without remorse. Within the first few days, thousands were killed. It is important to recognize that while the downing of the plane may have been a trigger for the genocide to commence, there were many factors that paved the way for a nearly countrywide policy of extermination of the Tutsis to proliferate throughout Rwanda. The events that would follow transpired quickly. Within a day, the government forces assassinated Rwanda's moderate prime minister, Madame Agath, the de jure leader of the country after Habyarimana's death. 10 Belgian UN peacekeepers, part of the United Nations Assistant Mission for Rwanda, UNAMIR, tasked with guarding the prime minister, would also be killed. The death of these men would lead to the eventual withdrawal of the entire Belgian contingent a week later. Within days of the violence, approximately 3,000 French and Belgian troops were deployed to assist in evacuating foreign nationals from the crisis. However, the evacuation mission did not include assistance to Rwandans, even those that were targets of the slaughter. On April 8th, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, also known as the RPF, a rebel militia operating out of Rwanda's northern border with Uganda, invaded Rwanda to bring an end to the killings and rescue its 600 troops that were stationed in Kigali as part of a peace agreement known as the Arusha Accords. The Arusha Accords were a power-sharing agreement that was signed in 1993 between the RPF and the government of Rwanda. It was meant to bring an end to the civil war that began in 1990. Power sharing was something that the Hutu extremists in Rwanda did not approve of. On April 21st, 2 weeks after the genocide began, the UN Security Council unanimously voted to draw down the UNAMIR peacekeeping force from the 2,500 troops that were still left to only 270. The United States was a major proponent in UNAMIR's withdrawal, due to the fact that the UN peacekeeping mission had been in Rwanda to help implement the now defunct Arusha Accords. It was impossible for UNAMIR to carry out its mandate. Instead of adjusting the force's mandate and bolstering troop counts to help protect civilians, the UN opted to withdraw the troops almost entirely. By this point, it is estimated that tens of thousands had been killed. In mid-May, after thousands of innocent Tutsis had been killed, the UN agreed to deploy UNAMIR 2, with a stronger mandate and increased troop count in an effort to protect civilians. However, the deployment of the troops and equipment was heavily delayed, and it wasn't until late June that French troops deployed to Rwanda's southwest border with Zaire. They tried to set up a safe zone in the country for civilians to go to. However, the killings continued to happen within the safe zone, and it effectively helped to allow genocidaires to cross over into Zaire. On July 4th, the RPF took over control of Kigali, and by mid-July, they had controlled the entire country. This effectively brought an end to the genocide. All told, at the end of the genocide, nearly 1 million Rwandans had lost their life, mainly the Tutsi. Throughout the course of the genocide, it must be recognized that many of the UNAMIR forces that were in Rwanda at the height of the crisis put their lives on the line to help protect civilians, and in many cases were successful in doing so. Even some unarmed peacekeepers had somehow been able to prevent the slaughter of some civilians that would undoubtedly have been killed had the UN presence not been there. There's a debate over whether or not a more robust UNAMIR force could have prevented or stopped the genocide. Given that the majority of the killings were with clubs and machetes in the hands of ordinary civilians, it is difficult to imagine that even with 5,000 troops, that UNAMIR could have completely quelled the violence. Although it is almost undeniable that a more robust presence would have at least slowed the rate of the killings. We see echoes of this today in the Central African Republic, where people are killing in brutal fashion, and the peacekeepers on the ground are finding it difficult to stop the violence. Today, and for the next 100 days, we remember those who died. We stand with their families, with their loved ones, and with their friends. But while we remember the past, we must also look to the present and the future. We must take the harsh lessons that Rwanda taught us today and put them to good use. We must not say never again while we habitually fail again and again. The prevention of mass atrocities and genocide does not only come from improving our collective ability to intervene once a crisis is underway, but also by investing in sustainable, comprehensive ways to improve society's ability to resist. The only way genocide and mass atrocities are able to occur is if people are willing to carry them out. People like you and me, just people. So long as the voices and actions of those who seek to profess hate and do harm are louder and more forceful than those who extol compassion and kindness, we will never achieve, never again. We must look to bolster upstream conflict prevention strategies that get at the heart of why atrocities occur. The root causes of drivers of conflict need to be addressed in a sustainable way so that the world is not just putting out fires wherever they sprout up. Today, on the 20th anniversary of the genocide in Rwanda, I ask you to think about the world 20 years from now. Will we be commemorating the 40th anniversary of the Rwandan Genocide and looking to comparisons to other places fraught with genocide and mass atrocities as we do today in places like Kar, Syria, or South Sudan? Or will we be commemorating the 40th anniversary of the Rwandan Genocide and celebrating a shorter but equally meaningful anniversary of the last instance of genocide and mass atrocities? I sincerely hope for myself and for my children that it's the latter. To take us to the conversation of how we can improve the ability to prevent and mitigate instances of mass atrocities and genocide, we will turn to our panelists, Allison and David. From them, we will hear about the evolution of peacekeeping since Rwanda, challenges peacekeeping missions still face today, and some new and emerging norms like the responsibility to protect. How, if at all, Rwanda has affected the international community's reaction to places like Darfur, South Sudan, Kar, Burma, or even Syria. We will also hear about the role of accountability, rule of law, and justice. How have these issues evolved since Rwanda? What has changed in the last 20 years? And how can these efforts in some way prevent future atrocities from occurring? So there will be time for questions from the audience later in the program, but for now I'd like Allison to give her opening remarks.
Thanks very much, and thank you to all of you for having me here. I will admit I'm a bit jet lagged because I am actually just back from the Central African Republic. And to paint a little bit of a picture for you about what's happening there in case you haven't had the opportunity to read about it. When I was there for just 1 week, the violence upticked quite extremely. I was just in the capital, Bangui, and in that week, 16,000 people were displaced. Across CAR, we now have over 625,000 people displaced. And the background of this is that over a year ago, an armed group called the Seleka came down through the country and took over the government. And as they were doing that, they burned a lot of the villages. They destroyed a lot of the infrastructure, for example, the radio networks. They destroyed the registration where citizens are registered, and those are used for all sorts of things, including elections and voting. They destroyed the prisons. In December, it looked like things were going to get better. There was a transition government that we could tell was sort of in its last days. Things were sort of looking like they might calm down. But unfortunately, groups which are very loosely affiliated called the Anti-Balaka took up arms. And they started committing revenge attacks on their neighbors. And the thing about the Central African Republic is that Muslims and Christians have lived really peacefully together for many years. But there have been much deeper dimensions of what's going on in the Central African Republic that we see in a lot of other countries in Africa. We have pastoralist farmers that are trying to ensure that their cattle are able to feed and water themselves against farmers. We have a lot of marginalization of certain populations and minority groups and geographic areas in CAR. There's been an absence of government and an absence of governance for many years there. And so in the past just couple of months, we've seen almost the entire Muslim population of certain areas of CAR flee over the border. People are being killed by machete, by knife, by homemade guns, by homemade weapons. And a lot of this is about revenge, because the Muslim population there has often been the traders. They're the ones that have a lot of the resources of the economics, and unfortunately, they were associated with this Seleka group that had come down and committed atrocities in the previous year. And because the groups are now not speaking to each other, even if they were neighbors before, they have been separated, and so they don't know what the other is thinking. And while many of them are growing tired and would like to come back together because they understand that the social fabric of their country is dependent on these communities having more than just one group or another group, they literally don't know what the others are thinking, and so they're scared. In one town called Boda outside of Bangui, there are thousands of Muslims living in a 4-block neighborhood with 2 streets. They have only been reached a couple times by assistance, so people are often malnourished, they faint, and they cannot leave that 4-block area without being killed. This is the kind of situation that we have seen over and over, and that doesn't always make the headlines. I think we were very lucky that a couple months ago, as this was kicking off, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Samantha Power, went there to try and shed light on this situation, and that the United States committed some resources to trying to help get more African peacekeepers in there. The French have sent troops, etc. I was also, before this, very closely following South Sudan. My organization and I run a project there. I'm very close with that country because I lived there for 2 years. And I think we were all very shocked as well at how quickly what was a political disagreement and conflict at the national level devolved into, again, an ethnic crisis that was really a political one, but where there were political actors manipulating old ethnic tensions and rivalries until you again had neighbors killing neighbors. And one of the fastest displacements I think I've seen, we had over 1 million displaced in about a month. We have probably what I think is the largest peacekeeping crisis since Rwanda. 70,000 people are still inside of the bases of UNMISS peacekeeping operation in South Sudan, which is a very vulnerable place to be. And a lot of people in New York congratulated themselves that at least 20 years after Rwanda, the peacekeeping operations opened their doors to allow fleeing people in who were vulnerable. But as somebody like myself who's been working on peacekeeping operations and atrocity prevention for 20 years, I have to ask myself if that's really enough to be congratulating ourselves. So I just want to talk very briefly about two of the evolutions of what we have seen progress on in the last 20 years and some of the challenges, and then leave a lot of the details for the Q&A. The first thing I want to talk about is that after Rwanda and Srebrenica and these events that happened 20 years ago, we had this norm called the responsibility to protect that was created by a number of thinkers and leaders in the international community. And basically what it said was there are these 4 crimes that are very egregious and they can never happen again. And so we're going to create 3 pillars to try and make sure that they don't happen again. The one is to say that a host state government, a government, is in charge of, has the responsibility of protecting its own civilians. If they don't have the capacity to do that, the international community has a responsibility to help them have that capacity. So that's the second pillar. And then the third pillar is if the government is unwilling or unable to protect their own civilians, then you sort of have a more open door to figure out what you're going to do. And that's often interpreted, and rightfully so, that if the government isn't doing anything, essentially you can do an international intervention. Unfortunately, that kind of challenging of the sovereignty of a state goes against now hundreds of years of the idea of non-interference in other states' responsibilities. And it maintains, it today continues to be a really contentious issue. Countries do not like it when their sovereignty is challenged. And we haven't actually seen very many situations where there was a really high threat against civilians where we've actually gone in without the permission of the government. Libya is the most recent example of that, but that is quite rare and it has ramifications which we can talk about in the Q&A. And I think there's a lot of confusion out there about sort of the difference between the responsibility to protect and what tools we actually have as an international community to intervene. Because that is such a sort of political third rail of action, we still depend really heavily on peacekeeping operations. And the reason we do that is because peacekeeping operations have very limited both political and pragmatic ways to do their job. And I'll just draw one of those limitations now, and then I'd like to talk about the evolution of what has and hasn't changed. So peacekeeping operations require the consent of the parties to a conflict, and actually that usually gets translated now as the host state government to deploy on the ground. And so the host state government has to sign off and say, yes, we want you to come into our country. And if a host state government starts to decide that they don't like the peacekeeping operation presence, it gets very difficult relationship-wise. The second thing is that peacekeeping operations, the doctrine says that they're only allowed to use force at the tactical level, at the local level, and doesn't say anything about it above that. That's a very big limitation on what you can do and what you're allowed to do as a peacekeeping operation, because you may have a threat coming at you that requires a much higher level of force to deter it or to compel it to stop and even sometimes to neutralize it. The first time that peacekeeping operations were given the authorization to use this force in order to protect civilians versus just protect themselves was after Rwanda. It was in Sierra Leone in 1999. And almost every major peacekeeping operation since then has been given, modern peacekeeping operation has been given a Chapter 7 mandate, which is the authorization to use force to protect civilians under threat. So right now, 99% of all troops and personnel serving in peacekeeping operations, if I'm getting this right, Google just to check, but I'm pretty sure it's 99%, it was 95 about a year ago, serve under these mandates with the authorization to use force to protect civilians. And so we think, okay, great, we've got this. Why isn't this working? Why do we continue to see peacekeeping operations that are not only unable to protect civilians, but unable to protect themselves? I'll give you an example. In South Sudan, when the individuals under threat were fleeing in the first days of the violence, a number of civilians fled into a small operating base of the UNMISS peacekeeping operation in a place called Akobo. In that, the armed actors continued to attack and killed UN peacekeepers, as well as a number of civilians that had sought refuge. We've seen the shoot down of UN helicopters. We have seen attacks on UN bases. So there are limitations to what a peacekeeping force can do when it comes to using force. One of the big challenges to this is the fact that there aren't that many troops out there that have been trained in peacekeeping that actually, or they may have been trained, but they don't necessarily have the right assets or doctrine and training to come into a peacekeeping operation. We normally have big infantry battalions come in, foot soldiers, and everybody wants boots on the ground, right? We want to try and cover as much area as possible. But the thing is the number of troops you can get deployed is never going to be able to provide the kind of protection across a geographic area that you need. Because these guys are trained to do offensive military operations, and now they're being told you're supposed to use a really constrained use of force, and sometimes you're supposed to do it in an urban area, which you haven't been trained to do necessarily. You're not special ops. You don't want to hit a civilian when you shoot, which happens when you're in an urban situation and you've got people who you aren't even sure if they're an armed actor or not because they're picking up weapons and putting them down. That creates a lot of problems. We also don't have enough police. So a lot of these situations that I was mentioning, the urban environments aren't really appropriate, nor are these IDP camps or the refugee camps or inside, whenever you have a large group of population, you don't really want military operating inside that. You may want a military to create a perimeter around it, but you need somebody who's been trained in policing and understands how to use a lower level of force with a civilian population. We have very few policing capacities around the world, at least from countries that are willing to donate. I just want to shift a little bit from the military side and the troop and the guns and the helicopter side, because that's what we hear a lot about in press, right? Where the troops in Darfur don't have enough helicopters, South Sudan doesn't have enough helicopters, et cetera, et cetera. One of the other big changes that happened after Rwanda and Srebrenica and other failures of the 1990s was that peacekeeping operations went from being a primarily military force to being also a state building and peace building operation. We expect them to go in and rebuild, but actually often build state institutions because they didn't exist before or they were destroyed in conflict. This means that they need to have all sorts of skills, lots of civilians that they can recruit that know how to do justice, that know how to do corrections, that know how to do training of police, that know how to do security sector reform, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of soldiers, civil affairs, etc. Peacekeeping operations weren't originally designed to do this. They still have a lot of trouble recruiting these people. And so we don't have sort of those assets that we might prefer also on the ground to do the long-term sort of peace building and reconciliation and state building that we'd like to see. One of the deficits that I'm particularly concerned with is a lot of these places like South Sudan and CAR are going to require a lot of local level reconciliation, widespread, in the same kind that we've heard great stories about after the Rwandan Genocide. And we just simply do not have enough support financially for that or enough capacity to get enough people into these areas to do that quickly enough. And I think there are questions about whether they should be part of peacekeeping operations or whether we should be bringing them from somewhere else because of how difficult it is for peacekeeping operations to deploy the right experts quickly. I'll just make two more comments because I'm sure I'm over my 7 minutes, 10 minutes. The first is that the other thing about the state building component is when you're a peacekeeping operation, you have relatively little leverage. I think we all like to believe that a peacekeeping operation can go in there and kind of, throw some elbows with the host state government to try and get them to move through the reforms that they've committed to state building, peace building wise. And that's just simply not the case. They don't offer money. Peacekeeping operations don't have any programming money. they have political persuasion, which means if international donors who are actually funding, are sending the guns for security sector reform of the national armies, are bringing in all the development money, aren't leaning on those host state governments, the peacekeeping operation isn't going to get very far. And so we have this now sort of precarious balance where peacekeeping operations are constantly trying to maintain the consent of the government to stay on the ground and be nice guys to kind of push them forward, and at the same time are supposed to be monitoring their human rights records, criticizing their human rights records, and potentially standing up when it's the host state government themselves that are committing the abuses. And that's what we see in a lot of places. And no peacekeeping operation has been able to actually achieve that balance in a way that appropriately protects people on the ground and is able to sort of stop from moving from what are consistent human rights violations and political problems to the situations of crises that we now have in South Sudan and CAR. I, of course, could go on for hours about this because I'm obsessed with it, but I'll stop there so we can get to Q&A. And also, I know David has a lot of insight on the accountability and justice side.
Thanks so much. And I do want to say at the outset that I think one thing that has changed, I mean, I think both of us, all of us are kind of talking about programmatic changes and how the international architecture has responded to the Rwandan genocide. But it does seem to me that one thing that has changed in a very positive direction is the level of attention. I think a crisis like CAR is getting a lot more attention than would have been the case several decades ago. And that in itself is a very important thing. It's not enough on its own. But I think it's important to take a moment to recognize the activists, the media people, the policymakers. You mentioned Samantha Power, who made one trip to CAR and is going to be making another one, I understand. And to have a high-level U.S. Policymaker going and talking about the importance of this, that really makes a difference. And so I think at least in the sense of public and expert attention, we have come a ways from the days of the Rwandan genocide. I wanted to talk in particular about the aspect of international criminal justice, and in particular the notion, which was really started, of course, with the Nuremberg trials, that certain crimes are so serious and so grave that they require international investigation and prosecution. And that was, an idea that obviously was very powerfully articulated during the Nuremberg and to a lesser extent during the Tokyo trials after World War II. And that thread of international accountability was picked up again in the early 1990s, really with the creation of the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia to respond to some of the atrocities there. Shortly after that tribunal for the former Yugoslavia was created, of course, the events that Mike described occurred in Rwanda. And by November of 1994, so a few months after the genocide has ended, the UN Security Council has acted to create a new tribunal to address those crimes. And so in international organization terms, the speed of this was fairly remarkable to set up a new international tribunal within that space of time. And it's also important that when the UN Security Council created the tribunal for Rwanda, it did so with the explicit goal not only of addressing, investigating, and prosecuting the crimes that have been committed, but with the notion that responding to those crimes and providing some level of accountability would itself contribute to the maintenance of peace and security, both in Rwanda and in the region. And what I'd like to do is just speak for a few moments about how that experience of trying to apply international justice to Rwanda has worked out, and then some broader questions about what the state of international justice is as a mechanism for responding to mass atrocities. So first of all, the Tribunal for Rwanda, I think it is fair to say, got off to a slow start. It took a while to get the tribunal established. This is kind of a logistical feat to, get judges and lawyers and people who can staff the tribunal, let alone gathering the evidence that's going to be required. And there was certainly, if you look at people who've studied the tribunals, there was plenty of criticism of the Tribunal for Rwanda. But I think it's important at this stage now, 20 years after the fact, to look at the significant accomplishments of this tribunal. There were more than 90 indictments, and those included very senior level people in the regime that was responsible for the genocide, very senior people in Rwandan society, and of those, only a small handful remain at large. So the vast majority of those that were indicted were investigated and prosecuted successfully. And if you look at the specific cases and the decisions of the tribunal, you find that there were groundbreaking decisions related to the definition of genocide. Some of the first cases actually applying genocide in a situation and convicting somebody of genocide occurred through the Tribunal for Rwanda. You find very important decisions on rape as a crime against humanity. There were also important decisions about the role of not just governmental and official people in the genocide, but also, for example, the role of the media. And one of the aspects that's important about the Rwandan genocide is that radio broadcasters, others played an important role in fanning the flames of the genocide, and the tribunal had some very important cases looking at the culpability of media figures. So I think both, if we look at the overall record in terms of the number of indictments, the number of people prosecuted, and also if we look at the substance of the cases, these were very important cases for the advancement of certain principles of international accountability for these crimes. The broader record of the Tribunal for Rwanda, and particularly if we start to incorporate not just a legal perspective, but also a political perspective, is, I think, significantly more mixed. The tribunal helped to do something very important at a political, social level, which was that it helped, and it wasn't the only actor in this, to create a formal historical record of the genocide. And that, I think, is something that is very important. It is not easy to do in a situation where there's so much destruction, so much death, but I think the tribunal has played a very important role in that. And that, I think, forecloses, and I think people have articulated this as one of the real values of international justice mechanisms, that makes it harder for people, and there are always people in these situations, who would like to deny what has occurred. And the tribunal and the work of researchers and historians has really made that impossible, to deny what happened. But in terms of the political impact, I think there are some significant drawbacks and limitations to what the tribunal did. In particular, I think the question of whether the tribunal fairly addressed crimes by all sides in Rwanda during that period is very much open. The tribunal attempted at a couple of points to investigate crimes that were alleged to have been committed not by the Hutu-led regime, but also by the Rwanda Patriotic Front, the RPF, which then subsequently moved into the government. And the tribunal initiated some investigations, but found that it hit political brick walls in terms of investigating atrocities by the other side in this conflict. And I don't think anyone would remotely try to say that the crimes were of comparable gravity. They obviously weren't, but there were significant crimes committed by RPF forces, and the tribunal really was not able politically to address those because the Rwandan government wasn't willing to see them investigated, and because I think the international community really wasn't willing to push the point when the new government was a government they were trying to bolster and support. Even more broadly, I think the question of whether the tribunal and having international justice in Rwanda contributed to peace and security in Rwanda and in the region is a difficult question to answer, and it's a difficult question to answer positively. Because what we saw after the Rwanda genocide was essentially a follow-on cycle of violence that spread to Zaire, now Democratic Republic of Congo. There's been continuing violence in eastern Congo, and the toll of the violence in Zaire, DRC, by many tallies reaches up to the millions as well, depending on exactly how you count. And so I think it would be quite a stretch to say that administering justice in Rwanda had the effect of deterring significant violence later on in the region. I think the experiences of the ICTR, both the good and the not so good, in many ways foreshadowed some of the challenges that would face the International Criminal Court. And it's important to recognize that the tribunals created for Yugoslavia and for Rwanda were absolutely critical in generating momentum and pressure for the creation of an international criminal court. That court was negotiated in 1998 and became operational in 2002. It is actually now conducting a second investigation in the Central African Republic and has been involved in a number of these mass atrocity situations. But the ICC, like the Rwanda Tribunal, faces difficult questions about politically how able is it to administer justice impartially. And so you'll find that there are many criticisms, including from a number of African leaders, about whether the ICC is administering justice fairly or whether it is focusing on certain regions to the exclusion of others. One of the kind of perverse ironies that has emerged is that Rwanda's government has actually become one of the most outspoken critics of the International Criminal Court, which is, as I said, was in many ways born because of the Rwanda Tribunal and the Yugoslav Tribunal. And the Rwandan government has criticized the ICC for what it believes is an unwarranted focus on Africa, an unwillingness to investigate and prosecute situations in other parts of the world, including situations that involve some of the world's most powerful states. So it is a mixed record. I think, as Allison indicated, it is a mixed record in justice as it is in terms of peacekeeping. There is no moment at which I think any of us are going to be able to say that the international community has solved the problem of mass atrocities. But I do think it's important when we can to highlight the progress that has been made, because the progress is always going to be inadequate. There are always going to be situations of new atrocities. But I think we have a real problem as an international community sometimes in recognizing fully and acknowledging progress. And that is, I think, kind of a structural problem when it comes to the prevention of mass atrocities. It is very rare that you find a situation where you can say clearly and authoritatively, we prevented mass atrocities. Instead, you'll have a situation where some mass atrocities are committed. They may not be as bad, as severe, or as widespread as they would have been, but it is very hard to, in a sense, to declare victory. And I think there's a danger in that. I mean, there's both a good side in that it continues to push us to respond more effectively, but the negative side is that sometimes I think it leads to unwarranted despair. And it leads people who study peacekeeping, who study international justice, to say kind of that everything's inadequate. But some things are more inadequate than others. And I think the world community has actually come a significant way in terms of attention, in terms of the way that peacekeepers respond, in terms of international justice, in at least having a response, however many deficiencies it may have to this kind of situation. I'll leave it there.
Thank you both. I think you ended on a very good point that there have been many steps toward progress that have been made since Rwanda, clearly, but like you said, it'll never be enough for most people, right?
Right. Nor should it, but
yeah. I think we'll start with you, David, just because you were on this topic, and then really dive into everything with you, Allison, since you laid out so many things. So as you pointed out, between the ICTY and the ICTR, there was these many ad hoc courts that were set up after mass conflicts, and that gave birth to the ICC eventually. And like you said, the ICC also has a lot of problems that these ad hoc courts also had.
Yeah.
And a big push lately has been for more hybrid courts in the country that the conflict has occurred in. You hear this a lot when you're talking about, at the end of the conflict in right now with South Sudan, what should happen? Possibly hybrid courts. Hybrid courts being, mixing judges that are from the host country, but also judges from around the international community, usually within the region, so other African states, for instance. I'm just wondering, what is your take on this new, push for hybrid courts versus this, the ICC with all of its flaws and the inability, obviously, with, time and effort and money that they have, they clearly can't try everyone who's guilty in CAR, in South Sudan, Syria, et cetera.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. And there has, I think one of the reasons, actually, that there has been this push for hybrid courts is in part because of situations like Rwanda. And I didn't mention this in my initial remarks, but if you look at the Security Council vote that created the Tribunal for Rwanda, the one government on the council to vote against the creation of the tribunal was the Rwandan government. And this is not the genocidal government, this is the post-genocide government that voted against the creation of the Rwanda tribunal because of significant questions it had about the procedures, because of its feeling that the punishments that could be meted out by this tribunal were not going to be enough. For example, there's no provision for the death penalty in the Tribunal for Rwanda. And so right from the outset, you see a real divide between how the international community wants justice to be done in Rwanda and the way that the Rwandan government wants justice to be done. And that divide, in many respects, it kind of waxed and waned as the years went on, but there were moments of real almost breakdown between the relations between the tribunal and the Rwandan government. And that, I think, feeds into this broader critique that international justice, which is done typically in The Hague, thousands of miles away from places where the atrocities have been committed, is simply too detached, too far away from the societies in question, from the individuals in question, for it to have that kind of therapeutic, rehabilitative impact that many people hope that international justice can have. The problem, of course, is that hybrid tribunals, and they've tried this with Sierra Leone and Cambodia, they have their own difficulties. It's not easy to mesh international standards, international procedures with national procedures. I'm not an expert in it, but what I've heard about the Cambodia tribunal, or the Extraordinary Chamber in Cambodia, has not been very positive. Moreover, there's the question of, well, we've spent millions of dollars and years of effort to create the ICC. If we now simply address these issues through hybrid tribunals, what was the purpose of creating the ICC? I think the more likely solution in the future is going to be to have the ICC out there as kind of, I don't want to say a threat, but as a fallback should national justice be completely unwilling to address the situation, but then have significant international pressure and international assistance as well to make sure that national institutions are able to at least address in some respect the crimes that have been committed. And I think you see in, for example, Democratic Republic of Congo, some real effort and some real money going into trying to set up national judicial mechanisms that can deal with those crimes, because just as you said, Mike, the ICC is never going to be able to prosecute more than a handful of people. So I think the international community is still very much working out how to balance international and national proceedings.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I mean, the whole purpose of the ICC is that court of last resort.
Right.
So, the more that these, hybrid courts or other mechanisms nationally can be bolstered up in the long term, not just, on this ad hoc basis, but sustainably as well, would also help, for, take some of the onus off the ICC as well. Great. So, Allison, you mentioned a lot of the issues, that peacekeeping still has today, and, obviously some of the things that have changed, probably the biggest thing that's changed is this, force mandate, right? So moving from almost exclusively Chapter 6 missions to exclusively Chapter 7 missions. And in some rare cases, like you said in Sierra Leone, like giving more fighting force capability, and now with, the UN and the DRC with the Force Intervention Brigade, for instance. It's perhaps shocking to some people that one of the major lessons from Rwanda was this problem with the mandate from the UNAMIR force. They weren't able to go out and protect civilians. They weren't able to go out and use their guns. That hasn't really fully been solved yet. Maybe if you could just speak a little bit to that as to
Sure.
what are some of the hang-ups.
Well, I do think, I sort of mentioned doctrine and training. And one of the big gaps that my institution looked at over the last 10 years was this lack of doctrine and training for militaries, because doctrine for militaries determines everything that comes after it, how the whole military is put together, the logistics, all of it. And there wasn't doctrine about protection of civilians basically anywhere in the world. And there was a real misunderstanding of what protection of civilians meant when you were trying to proactively protect by getting between a threat and a vulnerable population versus just to abide by the laws of war, by international humanitarian law. And so where we have seen progress is in that area. It took a while, but there is now widespread recognition that there's a gap there. And the US has started to try and develop doctrine for their military. If NATO and the French or the UK and others also try and do that, that's quite good, because a lot of countries tend to use those doctrines as the jumping off point for their own doctrine that they create and or train to. I mean, in general, the UN actually doesn't have doctrine for military. So, let alone doctrine for protection of civilians. And that makes sense to a certain degree, because you have militaries coming and contributing from all over. And it's their responsibility to train their military, before they come. So I think it would be quite difficult to try and ask the UN to put too much military doctrine into play. They've created training, and they've been trying to get that training out to peacekeeping training centers, especially of the big troop contributing countries. So that's been a big, I think, piece of progress over the last 5 years. But I think it is really difficult if you're talking about a peacekeeper on the ground. Some of it really is. We still don't have the right kind of assessment and strategies. Military actors, they assess the threats, and then they try and figure out what is the means and the motivation by which the threat is going to be perpetrated. And each different armed actor requires a different unique response. What works in one area with one armed actor to protect doesn't necessarily work somewhere else. And that's sort of the cookie cutter approach we've been taking in peacekeeping. All you really think you're supposed to do is patrol, and you might not even get off your vehicle to patrol. You don't necessarily have the language assistance that you need, that sort of thing. So it's really hard as a peacekeeper to feel like you've got the information you need to determine exactly how much force you're supposed to use. These militaries that contribute, they don't get advances professionally necessarily for taking home bodies in body bags of their own troops. And, yes, they get paid to contribute, et cetera, but I think, coming from a country who ourselves don't contribute troops, form troops to a peacekeeping operation, although we do contribute a tremendous amount of money, and the U.S. has dedicated a lot to try and help get peacekeepers and peacekeeping operations more able to protect civilians. It's really hard, I find, for myself to criticize issues around the use of force and when it's appropriate or not. If you have a bunch of people coming at you, some of whom are youth, with arms, to figure out whether you're going to shoot into that crowd or not and whether that's actually going to work, those are really hard questions that I think we ask a lot of companies and military guys on the ground to make those kinds of decisions in split seconds when they don't have the training and the doctrine behind them to do that. So I do think that's one of the problems. We have other persistent problems as well of troop contributing countries, basically capitals telling them not to use force against host state governments, those sorts of things. But I think there's some other really root causes that could be addressed. And I may have sounded a bit glib when I was giving my presentation, but part of that is because there are actually incredible opportunities at this moment to do the reforms that we need on peacekeeping operations. And I think, unfortunately, this happens, but we saw massive changes after Rwanda and Srebrenica. And I think the crisis that we're seeing right now in South Sudan and Central African Republic, we are already seeing an openness to new ideas among the UN Security Council about how to do this and do it better. And so what we may be seeing is our second generation of reforms around atrocity prevention through peacekeeping operations if we take this moment to actually focus on it and do something. And I just really hope we see it as the window of opportunity it is, because I do talk to a lot of, Security Council members and member states and stuff who are rather, they don't see this, they just see it as another, what do we do now? So.
I'd like to open it up for questions from the audience, if anybody has any. We have a mic over here that you could line up for.
From taking international conflict relations, I know that there's like a set number for a mass murder before the international community gets involved. And wouldn't it be a smarter idea to get involved early on as soon as the conflict starts rather than wait until there's 1,000 deaths before getting involved?
So maybe you can come advocate on this is an issue that upsets me to no end. Yeah. So we're talking about really egregious crimes, and a lot of times there's a lot of political wrangling over, is what's happening here genocide? Is it ethnic cleansing? Is it crimes against humanity? And by the time you get through what are essentially legal definitions that require a court to figure that out, people are dead. And so what we're really trying to fight against is the idea that you have to reach some number threshold. A lot of people talk about 4,000 across a country within a year or a certain amount of time. And one of the, we were talking about indicators. How do you indicate whether something is happening or not happening? There's huge controversy over how you count how civilians are killed in conflict. We are just now getting the kind of databases and research mechanisms open where we can start to kind of get better information about that. But it's very difficult. And I have, in my conversations with government and tabletop exercises with them, it's sort of, now we have so much information available to us, from a military intelligence point of view or whatnot. Even when you're in a scenario situation, like when they're doing war gaming or something, and you say, okay, the number's now gone to 6,000, it's gone to 12,000. People still say, but we want more information before we act. And you're totally right. To get farther up in the prevention stream, you don't want to wait till you get to a certain number. We talk a lot about widespread or systematic. And the widespread is across the geographic area. It kind of gets at the scale. We talk about systematic a little bit differently than it's probably defined in legal terms, in the sense that you have to be looking at the motivation of the actors, which is sometimes often hard to determine because actors' motivations are dynamic. They differ between the highest level of the perpetrator and the person on the ground who's following orders or has been mobilized by hate speech. But those are the kinds of indicators that we think, if you look at, even when the violence lower level, that are going to indicate something happening. Those kinds of indicators were all over the place in South Sudan from before it seceded and vote to become, those types of crimes have been committed there for decades because of the history of the conflict. That's what we need to be looking at.
I think for international justice, the question, I think in policy terms, Allison and the questioner, you're undoubtedly right that we want to get involved as quickly as possible. But in international justice terms, there actually is an important question about when is it appropriate to start the international justice process. And there was an experience recently that I think made some people wonder whether it might not sometimes be better to wait. And that was the situation in Libya, where one of the first things the Security Council did was issue a referral to the ICC. The ICC started an investigation very quickly and then issued indictments very quickly of Gaddafi himself and 2 other senior regime officials. And there was at that time this was in the middle of the NATO intervention there, and there was a lot of talk about, well, mightn't it be helpful to figure out an exit strategy for Gaddafi? You know, have him go off and live somewhere and just get out of Libya so that we can get beyond this conflict. And I think a lot of people thought that maybe having the international indictment out there complicated that possibility of having him exit the situation. Now, I don't know, it's very difficult to know whether there was any potential for Gaddafi leaving. I tend to think not. But that question of whether international justice can actually get in the way of political processes and negotiations is very much something that is debated. My sense is that we're moving a little bit more in the direction of having international justice wait a bit before it gets launched into a situation and try to have politicians, humanitarian experts, military folks deal with a crisis first.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is sort of regarding like the hybrid courts and how to end these international tribunals. At the time, the Rwanda tribunal was supposed to end in 2008, but there were problems of finding other states that had the court systems to handle the cases and judicially, and then also states that had the prison system that could meet the UN standards of what prisons should be, which are much more humane than other prisons.
Both the Yugoslav Tribunal and the Rwanda Tribunal are, of course, in their very final stages now, and they've created what they call a mechanism, which is supposed to kind of serve to wrap up the affairs of the tribunal and do anything that the tribunals, any function that they still need to perform. But no, I think this question of kind of what happens after international justice and how international justice segues into national justice is something that is extremely complicated. One thing that they tried with the Yugoslav tribunal is to send a number of cases back to the Bosnian authorities. But there, to go back to what Mike was saying earlier, and you referenced hybrid mechanisms, they had set up a special chamber within the Bosnian judiciary with some international participation. And I don't know if they've done, I know some cases have been sent back to Rwanda. I don't know if they have a similar hybrid mechanism there. But I think the verdict on how that's worked in Bosnia has been very complicated and kind of and mixed. But yeah, I think that this notion of how to end international judicial interventions is a very difficult one.
Thank you for coming, and thank you guys for your contributions.
Thanks.
And appreciate you coming out.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.